As uncertainty swirls in the Western Pacific, the burning question remains: will China use military force to capture Taiwan? A territory it has long viewed as a wayward province, various Chinese leaders have worked diplomatically to try and isolate Taiwan, a small but densely populated country with a population of 23.5 million people living together in less than 14,000 square miles. But the small island's powerful position in the high-tech semiconductor market has been its lifeline. Producing nearly two-thirds of the world's semiconductors, Taiwan's dominance in this sector has allowed it to maintain independence with the tacit support of the US and other Western industrial partners like Japan and Germany. But will there come a time when China decides it can no longer play the long game and decide a quick, brutal invasion would be in their best interests? Just a stone's throw away, Taiwan sits roughly 100 miles from the Chinese mainland, with coastal areas between the two as close as 80 miles, and with that close proximity comes a shared history. Taiwan holds a key position as a vital anchor within the strategically important First Island Chain. This term refers to a series of archipelagos stretching from South Korea throughout Japan, Taiwan, the Philippines, and down to Australia. All these territories maintain friendly relations within the US, making them essential to maintaining American naval dominance in the Western Pacific Ocean. Taiwan is a significant contributor to the global semiconductor industry, accounting for over 60% of the world's semiconductor production and over 90% of the most advanced ones. This has helped give Taiwan an annual GDP of over $820 billion, which ranks them 21st in the world and showcases Taiwan's economic importance in the region. The First Island Chain effectively serves as a geographical barrier that restricts the access of potential adversaries, like China, to the open Pacific. This containment strategy allows the US to protect its power and influence in the region, while keeping potential threats at bay. Situated just east of the First Island Chain, the islands of Okinawa and Guam host significant military bases. Okinawa is home to approximately 26,000 U.S. military personnel, while Guam houses around 10,000. These strategic outposts provide the United States with the capability to respond swiftly and effectively to any regional conflict or crisis. Taiwan has had a long history of being fought over by one empire or another. European explorers first noted the island in the 1500s when they recorded the island's name as Formosa, or Beautiful Island. Both Dutch and Spanish traders created settlements there, but were kicked out when Ming loyalists under Zheng Chenggong, also known as Kojinga, drove the Dutch from Taiwan and established authority over the island in the mid-1600s. The Qing dynasty soon overran them and established their authority over the island in 1683. It wasn't until 200 years later, in 1885, that Taiwan was declared a province of the Qing Empire. A mere decade later, China was forced to give up control of the island to Japan after losing the First Sino-Japanese War in 1895. In 1912, Chinese revolutionaries overthrew the remnants of the Qing Empire and established the Republic of China. In the 1930s, the imperial forces of Japan invaded mainland China and caused untold devastation and millions of deaths. Both the ROC forces and the nascent Communist Party forces tried defending the country with the help of US and British forces. Amidst the chaos of war in 1943, US President Franklin Roosevelt, British Prime Minister Winston Churchill, and ROC leader Chiang Kai-shek convened in Cairo. They jointly declared that upon the Allies' victory over Japan, Formosa and the Pescadores would be returned to the Republic of China's control. True to their word, ROC officials re-established political and governmental authority in 1945 following Japan's defeat. Soon after the end of World War II, a civil war erupted in mainland China between the ROC forces, led by Chiang Kai-shek, and the ones controlled by the Chinese Communist Party, led by Mao Zedong, during which it is estimated that around 1.5 to 2.5 million military and civilian casualties occurred. By 1949, the much more numerous communist forces had declared victory and established political control in Beijing. Chiang Kai-shek and what was left of the ROC forces, known as the Kuomintang, fled to Taiwan, where they ruled for the next several decades. Actual fighting continued until October 25, 1949, when ROC forces defeated a potential invasion by CCP forces at the Battle of Gunningtao on Kinmen Island. The fighting actually led to the population of Taiwan increasing by approximately 2 million people as soldiers, civilians, and political figures sought refuge, which had a significant impact on Taiwan's demographics and contributed to a population increase of nearly 37% between 1945 and 1950. The continued threat of additional conflict caused Taiwan to declare martial law, which remained in effect until 1987. China conducted sporadic artillery fire against Taiwan-controlled islands beginning in 1950, which partially led to a joint defense agreement signed between the US and Taiwan in 1954. On August 23, 1958, artillery duels began between China and Taiwan that continued for 40 days. Since then, neither side has been willing to come to a full unifying agreement with the other. China points to the earlier 17th century history to say that Taiwan was originally a Chinese province, but the Taiwanese point to the post-Qing dynasty history to argue that they were part of the modern Chinese state that was first formed after the revolution in 1911, but not part of the People's Republic of China that was established under Mao in 1949. The more recent heavy-handed repression of civil rights in Hong Kong following their unification with China in 1997 has since reinforced Taiwan's determination to remain independent. Today, China's position on Taiwan can be described as a precarious diplomatic dance. Chinese President Xi Jinping declared as recently as 2021 that the reunification with Taiwan must be fulfilled. However, Taiwanese officials, noting the increase of Chinese jet incursions and the People's Liberation Army/Navy, or planned ship incursions, near Taiwanese shores, say that relations between the two countries are at their lowest in the past 40 years. China has, however, left open the possibility of a more peaceful reconciliation. In 2021, at a ceremony honoring the 110th anniversary of the end of China's last imperial dynasty in 1911, Xi said unification in a peaceful manner was most in line with the overall interest of the Chinese nation, including Taiwan compatriots. However, he added, no one should underestimate the Chinese people's staunch determination, firm will, and strong ability to defend national sovereignty and territorial integrity. Xi had previously taken a much harsher tone in July of 2021 when he threatened to smash any efforts of support for Taiwan's independence. So now the lingering question remains, will China decide to use military force to bring the island under Communist Party control? Despite China's posturing, there are several reasons why such a possibility is actually looking increasingly less likely. And one of the main reasons has nothing to do with China, but with their neighbor to the north, Russia. Until Russian President Putin's invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, most analysts considered Russia the second most powerful military in the world, second only to the United States and surpassing even China's larger but less modernized forces. However, the reality on the ground has proved much different. Russia's military has been revealed as a paper tiger, with so many problems and inadequacies that now it might not be considered in the top 10 militaries of the world. One of the biggest surprises was the overall weakness of Russian equipment. Russia has depended on selling their tanks and fighter jets overseas in order to offset the costs of building such expensive equipment in bulk. But their more modern tanks have proven woefully incapable of standing up to much cheaper and more numerous NATO and US anti-tank missiles. The Russian Air Force has also been revealed as far less capable than many analysts thought. The skies over Ukraine have been largely clear of Russian aircraft since the first months of the war, when US-supplied Stinger missiles and other ground-launched assets took a heavy toll on Russian aircraft and helicopters. The situation is so bad that Russia has refused to fly its most modern fighter, the $40 million Su-57, over Ukrainian territory for fear it too will be shot down, which might prove to potential buyers that it cannot survive against a determined foe. Similar worries have led to Russia refusing to deploy its top-of-the-line tank, the T-14 Armata, though the platform is so expensive with each tank costing $4 million that only a handful have been produced. The realities of the Ukraine war have proved that a motivating and well-trained military provided with enough anti-tank and anti-air missiles by the West, can hold its own against a much more numerically superior country like Russia. Some of the lower estimates state that Russia has suffered more than 1,700 tanks destroyed or captured, while others have estimated it to be as many as 3,000. It's gotten so bad that Russia is turning to much older tanks to replace those losses. In March of 2023, civilian videos emerged of Russia showing ancient T-55s on train cars heading west. These tanks were outdated in 1973, yet the need for replacements is so dire that Russia is considering using them anyway. The results of the catastrophic losses Russia has suffered must be a wake-up call for the Chinese military leaders. Ukraine has had the benefit of NATO and US-led training since Russia's invasion in 2014, yet Taiwan has been training and preparing for an invasion for more than 40 years. The value of a technologically robust defense involving missiles and drones plays right into the hands of Taiwan, which is as technologically sophisticated as any nation on Earth. They may have only 3,000 full-time military members, but they have the backing of the US Navy's Pacific assets, as well as likely support from South Korea and Japan. All of these combined means that China would have a much more difficult task of invading and holding Taiwan than it previously might have believed. But China might have an even bigger lesson to learn from looking at Russia, something that would frighten them even more: worldwide boycotts and sanctions. Following close on the heels of Russia's military disasters, the effect of Western sanctions on Russia has come as a rude shock to China, which depends far more on imports than Russia. In fact, China is the world's largest importer, with its imports accounting for over 10% of the global total. But what has hit Russia the hardest has been the loss of access to Western semiconductors. It has gotten so bad that Russian soldiers have been bringing Ukrainian appliances home with them, primarily to remove their computer chips and other reusable components. Those sanctions won't affect China as much as the possible interruption of access to oil and natural gas, of which China imports between 70 and 75%. And while Russia has made up in part for its lack of access to Western buyers for its oil by selling more to China and India, they must now ship much of that through a much longer and more vulnerable route around the Horn of Africa, which adds roughly 10,000 nautical miles to the shipping route. Then there are the boycotts. China, more than any nation on Earth, depends on selling their products to overseas markets. In 2022, China's total exports were valued at $3.59 trillion, making it the world's largest exporter. So far, President Xi has walked a careful line between supporting Putin while calling for a negotiated peace in Ukraine. But Xi has pointedly refused to supply lethal aid like artillery shells and missiles to Russia for fear of earning itself the same kind of boycotts that Russia has endured. While such boycotts would undoubtedly increase the cost of consumer goods in the West, they would absolutely wreck the Chinese economy, as exports contribute to nearly 20% of China's GDP. Few outsiders realize just how top-heavy with billionaires the Chinese Communist Party really is. According to the Hurun Global Rich List for 2022, China had the most billionaires in the world, with a total of 1,133 compared to only 716 billionaires in the United States. And those mega wealthy make up a disproportionate number of the membership of the ruling CCP. According to the Hurun report in 2018, the net worth of the 153 members of China's parliament and its advisory board that it deems super rich amounted to $650 billion, up by nearly a third from the previous year. That figure is just slightly below the entire GDP of the country of Switzerland, which stood at $707.75 billion in 2021. In 2023, estimates concluded that all of the members of the National People's Congress and the Chinese People's Political Consultative Conference, at least 80 were billionaires. Such a disproportionate accumulation of wealth at the top of the government means China's political leadership is keenly aware of how risky an invasion of Taiwan would be to their own personal fortunes. Then there is the precarious nature of Chinese food supplies. While they do grow a large amount of their own food, they are still a massive importer of food. China is now the world's largest agricultural importer, surpassing both the European Union and the United States in 2019, with imports totaling more than $133 billion. China has some of the poorest soils of any major industrialized country, second only to Brazil. In order to offset this, China uses tremendous amounts of both fertilizer and pesticides. And while they have a strong supply of potash, one of the more important fertilizers, they are woefully short of the natural gas needed to produce nitrogen, another incredibly important part of large-scale agricultural fertilization. In order to produce their nitrogen, China relies heavily on imported natural gas. China's natural gas production may have increased by 6% in the first 8 months of 2022, compared with the same period in 2021, according to the National Bureau of Statistics. But that doesn't help when their consumption has grown even faster, at a compound rate of almost 11% over the same period from 2021 to 2022, as more households have been connected to the distribution network. China's net natural gas imports in 2021 climbed up to 170 billion cubic meters, up from just 29 billion cubic meters in 2011. The country relied on imported natural gas to meet 45% of its domestic consumption in 2021, up from 34% in 2016 and 21% in 2011. Any significant sanctions that interrupted just this one element, natural gas, could strip away China's ability to create the necessary fertilizer their food crops so desperately need. And with more than 1.3 billion people to feed, China could be staring at a famine not seen since Mao's time of the Great Leap Forward, when an estimated 30 million people died from poor food harvests and distribution between 1960 and 1962. Such a catastrophe has not been forgotten by Chinese leaders, and they have no desire to repeat those mistakes. And then there's the fickle nature of Sino-Soviet relations. In February 1950, Soviet Premier Joseph Stalin and Chinese leader Mao Zedong signed the Sino-Soviet Treaty of Friendship, Alliance, and Mutual Assistance. It was supposed to last for 30 years, but only a decade later, the alliance collapsed in a cataclysmic fashion, with Beijing denouncing Moscow for betraying communism and the Soviet Union reciprocating by ending all economic assistance to China. Today, we have Russian President Vladimir Putin and Chinese President Xi Jinping trying to duplicate a similar friendship, but they are facing equivalent, if not more daunting obstacles. For starters, the balance of power is now reversed. Whereas in 1950, the USSR was vastly more capable both militarily and economically than its ally China. Today, it is China that is by far the more dominant power. China has provided Russia with an outlet for much of its oil exports after the EU and the West denied them their previous markets. But China has been reluctant to give Putin and Russia more of the things at once, like advanced missiles, better drone technology than they can get from Iran, and a pipeline agreement to be able to ship crude oil and natural gas directly from Siberia to northern China. In return, China has goals at once that Russia doesn't want to provide. For example, China has made no secret of wanting the Far Eastern region around Vladivostok back. It's only been in Russian hands since 1860, when the area was ceded by China to Russia as a result of the Treaty of Aigun in 1858 and the ensuing Treaty of Peking in 1860. The foundations for a realignment of the Russia-Chinese frontier are deep. China and Russia have complained and occasionally come to blows over their shared border for centuries, while an official resolution, such as it was, only arrived in 2008. For a centuries-old border conflict that predates the official existence of both nations, China could easily claim an excuse to nullify current agreements and demand that Russia return Vladivostok, which China still calls by its previous name, Haishanwei, as well as some 20,000 square miles of previously Chinese territory that were included in the two treaties China was forced to sign. Such an addition to China would go a long way towards cementing Xi's position of strength at the head of the CCP and could reduce the desire to try to retake Taiwan for a decade or more. In fact, the Chinese claims on Vladivostok and the area around it are more deeply rooted in history than the CCP's more recent political claims to Taiwan. Prior to the Russian Revolution, ethnic Chinese residents made up more than 40% of the labor force in the regions surrounding Vladivostok, which are called the Amur and Primorsk oblasts. According to a 1907 census, around 62,000 Chinese residents lived in the Far East region of Russia, highlighting their significant presence in the area. The actual number was probably higher, as many Chinese did seasonal cross-border work as day laborers, in much the same way that Mexican laborers crossed the border to work in the U.S. in agricultural jobs. At that time, ethnic Russians were probably in the minority, which is why Stalin chose the inhumane but expedient policy of mass expulsions to China in order to guarantee Russian numerical superiority. Not to mention, Russia has been draining its Far East defenses in order to replace men and material lost in Ukraine. This extensive border has never before been so lightly defended by either side, and Russia has only further deteriorated the societal identity of the region by resettling the Ukrainians there who have been forcibly removed from their homeland. It won't be long before the ethnic Russian population is once again outnumbered by ethnically Chinese Russians, at which point an invasion by Xi could use the same "we're only protecting residents who speak and think like us" logic that Putin has tried to use in the Donbass. But Putin is an expander of territory, not a relinquisher, and he would certainly never agree to willingly hand back such a vital part of Russia's eastern geopolitical structure. That may be why there is no hard agreement following his and Xi's joint meeting in Moscow in March of 2023. Despite the platitudes and assurances of mutual support, Putin didn't get the agreement for more pipelines from Russia directly into China that he was hoping for, nor any specified deals for lethal aid in his failing Ukraine war. In fact, less than 2 weeks after Putin was left empty-handed at the curb as the Chinese delegation drove away, Xi launched a bold power move in Central Asia, once seen by Russia as their area of dominance. He invited a number of Central Asian nations, all of them previous Soviet-dominated republics, including Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, and Uzbekistan, to a grand foreign policy and diplomatic festival, specifically without including Russia. And such a direct snub by Xi shows exactly what he thinks of Putin. The inherent lopsided weakness of the current Sino-Soviet agreements shows just how fragile this friendship really is. And with the world losing respect for the Russian military on a daily basis, this area with its vast resources, large ethnically identical population, and lightly defended border might be too tempting a target for Xi and his military to resist. On the other hand, despite all these potential reasons to dissuade China from attempting a military invasion of Taiwan, there are equally compelling reasons to suggest China might actually be considering an invasion in the near future. One of the biggest is that China may truly believe that there is no one who can actually stop them. Many analysts believe that China has been encouraged by an internal perception of a decline in U.S. unity at home and a concurrent loss of prestige overseas. As early as 2008, following the United States' weak economic performance during the global recession, China's foreign policy began to grow more aggressive, spurred by a sense that China's economy remained strong even as the US and the EU's economies faltered. In fact, Chinese GDP grew at a rate of 9.4% in 2009, while the US economy contracted by 2.5% in the same year. The January 6, 2021 attack on the US Capitol, followed by the hasty withdrawal of US forces from Afghanistan in 2021, only seemed to support the Chinese belief that the U.S. was in decline. The U.S. military presence in Afghanistan, which peaked at around 100,000 troops in 2010, was fully withdrawn by August 31, 2021, signaling a significant shift in the U.S.'s strategic priorities and global influence. As recently as October 2022, U.S. Secretary of State Anthony Blinken noted that China was pursuing unification with Taiwan on a much faster timeline than previously expected. In his estimate of the situation, China had decided the status quo was no longer acceptable. And of course, when looking at the possibility of an invasion, it would be criminal not to factor in China's rapidly accelerating military improvements. Recently, China has been expanding its nuclear arsenal, while also modernizing its military both in quality and quantity. The US government estimates that China has increased its number of missile launchers from less than 100 in 2020 to more than 450 by the end of 2022, giving the PLA numerical parity with the US, which also has around 450 ICBM launchers. China's stockpile of nuclear warheads is expected to grow from 400 today to more than 1,000 by 2030. Some of the more modern Chinese ballistic missile submarines are now equipped with improved long-range missiles that reportedly could reach the continental United States. Those submarines have also begun to carry out operational patrols in the South China Sea, extending the Chinese PLA Navy reach much farther than it did just 20 years ago. The PLA Air Force is putting into service a B-2 copycat H-2 stealth bomber, which has an extended operating range with refueling of around 5,200 miles or 8,500 kilometers. This would place key, previously unreachable areas of the US at risk in new ways, along with threatening every nation from Japan to the Philippines and even parts of Australia and New Zealand. In July 2021, the PLA tested a hypersonic missile system that could deliver nuclear or non-nuclear payloads to the continental United States, potentially evading missile defenses. The mere existence of such weapons could encourage Chinese leaders to believe that they can intimidate their US counterparts into giving them a free hand in their Taiwan plans. Then there are the efforts of the PLA Navy to build an actual blue water fleet, based in part around its two in-service aircraft carriers, with an even more advanced third carrier, the Fujian, undergoing final fitting and sea trials. They still need to train at least 200 pilots to operate the needed naval fighters, however. They also need to replace China's only shipborne fighter jet, the underperforming twin-engine single-seat J-15 Flying Shark, nicknamed the Flopping Fish by Chinese press reports. It's known to be the world's heaviest carrier-borne fighter, and without its original Russian-produced engines, it cannot both carry a full armament and fuel for its targeted range. Either some weapons or onboard fuel must be sacrificed for it to fulfill even part of its planned mission. Still, just having viable aircraft carriers gives the PLA Navy an ability to project power in ways that it didn't have in past decades, and China can always call upon its vast number of smaller ships to overwhelm the US Navy and its allies. In 2015, the PLA Navy surpassed the US Navy in total numbers of ships, and the plan has continued to grow in the intervening years. The U.S. Congressional Research Service estimates that in 2021, the Chinese plan consisted of 348 ships and submarines, while the U.S. Department of Defense estimated their total number of vessels at a slightly higher 355 vessels. By comparison, the deployable battle force of the U.S. Navy, whose missions include posts in the Atlantic, the Mediterranean, and other areas besides the Pacific, totaled less than 300 vessels in fiscal year 2021. The fleets of other comparable nations are also much smaller. As of 2021, the British Royal Navy consisted of 76 ships, and the Royal Australian Navy had a fleet of only 44 ships. These recent Navy modernization and upgrade efforts have made China a more formidable power in the Western Pacific. China now feels strong enough to try to dictate the terms of its control over the South China Sea, extending down to an area called the Nine-Dash Line, which intrudes on the sovereign coastal areas of other nations including the Philippines, Brunei, Indonesia, Malaysia, and Vietnam. Such an expansion of their territorial waters had been ruled illegal by the United States in 2016. China has effectively ignored this ruling, as it has gone about occupying and building up several isolated land features, little more than occupied reefs and shoals, in the South China Sea. According to Western officials, this unprecedented move was only part of Beijing's long-running effort to strengthen claims to disputed territory in a region critical to global trade. Despite promises not to militarize such areas, PLA Air Force-controlled runways and naval ports have been developed on many of these islands, and PLA fighters routinely intercept other nations' airplanes and discourage them from flying in what they consider Chinese territorial airspace. And despite Russia's massive military losses in the Ukraine war, many in China believe that Putin's one notable success has been in using nuclear threats to limit direct US and NATO involvement in Ukraine. Putin's so far successful nuclear saber-rattling has been instructive for Chinese leaders. Although many analysts in the West are surprised by Russia's failure to achieve its initial objectives, along with the fortitude and resilience of the Ukraine forces and government, China has observed with interest how Putin has warded off direct Western intervention through nuclear threats, including provocative rhetoric weapons exercises and even raising the alert level of his nuclear forces, which is emblematic of a doctrine that the Russians, not coincidentally, call strategic deterrence. Dai Junjun, a scholar in the PLA's Academy of Military Science, claimed that at the start of 2023, that Russia's nuclear arsenal and major conventional systems, such as hypersonic missiles, serve as an effective strategic deterrence against direct US and NATO intervention in Ukraine. What might be considered as the success of Putin's deterrence may help convince Chinese planners that their nuclear arsenal could similarly deter the United States. Such overconfidence in their own capabilities, coupled with the false belief that Washington will allow them to deal with Taiwan without US opposition, could in turn lead China to believe an invasion could be successful. If US deterrence fails, if China grows more convinced of its own military capabilities and underestimates the US commitment to defending Taiwan, both countries could end up ensnared in a war between nations with nuclear arsenals. But then, one of the most likely reasons why China would actually invade Taiwan might just be the silliest, that it could stem from completely unintended consequences on all sides. In February of 2023, U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken had a very important and long-planned trip to Beijing on his schedule, but that trip was postponed, i.e. indefinitely canceled, amid concerns raised by what appeared at the time to be a Chinese spy balloon flying over the continental U.S. That singularly politicized event revealed that very real disconnect between the different ruling groups of China, the disunited military, foreign policy, and economic leadership cabals. Why would someone in the Chinese bureaucracy or military allow such a risky foreign policy move on the eve of such an important diplomatic event? It's highly possible that someone wanted the trip canceled, or that they wanted to intimidate the US leadership by showing that China could still access US airspace even if it was just for meteorological data. Either way, the Great Balloon fiasco displayed extremely poor judgment on the part of China's ruling elite. This leads to speculation that members of one sector of China's leadership might act without proper consultation with other members of the government. That someone in the military could pull the trigger on an invasion of Taiwan without first conferring with the foreign policy or diplomatic arms now seems a very real possibility. In addition, there's the danger of the cult of personality, which Xi has deliberately created, which makes it possible for a single dictator, often uninformed on the realities of a situation, to make a poor decision which no one in authority will oppose. Beginning in 2012, Xi worked strenuously to remove any possible opposition to his one-man rule. Now, there's no one left to tell Xi no. He doesn't get an honest appraisal of mistakes in China's economic or foreign policy, since too often in the past, Xi has metaphorically and sometimes literally shot the messenger. His cult of personality is even stricter than under Mao. Xi is a completely one-man show. He's removed any independent underlings and has made it a point to not reward independent thinking. An example of this bending over backwards to show Xi they're doing what they hope he expects them to do, no matter how wrong-headed attitude, was the bizarre efforts of one COVID cleanup group who washed down the runway of one of China's major airports because they thought that would show Xi just how hard-working they were. Of course, it did absolutely no good in combating the virus. In fact, much of China's zero-COVID policy was just bad science coupled with what Western observers called disinfectant theater. Similar bad ideas clothed in busy work may lead to additional mistakes, up to and including potential wars. But if the possibility of China invading Taiwan in the coming days is slim, then when might it happen? Perhaps sooner than you think. China is currently facing a declining birth rate, with the country's total fertility rate dropping to 1.18 children per woman in 2022, well below the replacement rate of 2.1. This had led to concerns about an aging population and a shrinking labor force. Furthermore, China's unsustainable agricultural dependence on imported natural gas is evident, as the country imported approximately 109 billion cubic meters of natural gas in 2022, accounting for around 45% of its total natural gas consumption. This reliance on imports makes China vulnerable to global market fluctuations and geopolitical tensions. Some analysts suggest that facing an economic slowdown and rising unemployment, China might be tempted to launch a military offensive to rally popular support. In January 2023, Taiwan's Foreign Minister Joseph Wu speculated that President Xi might create an external crisis in order to divert domestic attention or to show to the Chinese that he has accomplished something. But if China needs to make a diversion by expanding outward militarily, which direction should or can they go? They can't invade Kazakhstan due to the length of their supply lines, nor can they go over the Himalayas to India. They can't expand into Vietnam. The last time China tried that, in 1979, the Vietnamese did to them what it had done to the French, the Japanese, then the French again, and the United States. And despite the noted improvements, China doesn't yet have the Navy to take on the US and its allies Australia, the Philippines, South Korea, and Japan. Until it does, its hopes of naval invasion of Taiwan are mere bluff and bluster. So despite all the contraindications, it seems much less likely that China will invade Taiwan in the near future, and far more likely that they might try to wrestle the land around Vladivostok, or as they'd prefer to call it, Haishanwei, away from the weakened and regionally defenseless Putin. They may even find some way to generate an economic or military aid package whereby China removes the burden that is overseeing such a geographically isolated part of Putin's crumbling empire. Such a move would be right in keeping with Xi, who seems to prefer intimidation, but without risking an open confrontation that could destroy the wealth of the billionaires that make up such a disproportionate percentage of his ruling elite.